Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose. Before we get started today, I would like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as to not disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, please line up at this microphone here behind the pillar to ask your questions. If you cannot stand for any reason, please let a staff member know and we can walk a microphone over to you. Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Jazmine Ulloa, celebrating the release of El Paso, 5 Families and 100 Years of Blood, Migration, Race, and Memory. El Paso is a work of narrative nonfiction that gives new voice to history that has long been checked at the border or told through the lens of white men alone. From the Mexican Revolution and the Mexican repatriation to the shifting immigration laws under Reagan and Trump and the violence and bloodshed brought on by the drug war, El Paso captures a place often misunderstood or forgotten by the rest of the country and the world. Author Jazmine Ulloa is a national reporter for the New York Times. She previously reported for the Boston Globe, where she was part of a team that won the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting, and the Los Angeles Times. A native of El Paso, she started out as a journalist in Texas, where she worked for newspapers in Brownsville, San Antonio, and Austin. She's made appearances on MSNBC, CNN, and CBS, as well as in Al Jazeera's documentary television program Fault Lines. Ulloa will be in conversation with Jia-Lin Yang, a senior ideas writer at the New York Times, where from 2021 to 2025 she was national editor. She is also the author of One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, The Epic Struggle Over American Immigration, 1924 to 1965, a political history of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. Before joining the Times in 2017, she spent 7 years at the Washington Post as an editor and reporter covering national security, business, and economics. Ulloa will also be in conversation with Hamed Ali Aziz, who covers the Department of Homeland Security and immigration policy in the United States for the New York Times. He began covering immigration as a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle in 2017 and continued covering the beat at BuzzFeed News, the Los Angeles Times before joining the Times. Please join me in welcoming Jazmine Ulloa, Jia-Lin Yang, and Hamed Ali Aziz.
Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with all of you tonight and to be here with you, Jazmine and Hamed, some wonderful colleagues. First of all, Jazmine, congratulations on your debut this week as a book writer.
Thank you so much.
It's wonderful to see.
Hi.
And I just want to say briefly, having spent some time with your book this week, just how it is just arriving not a moment too soon in this country. And I think immigration is a subject, because I think of the language of law and politics, very easily dehumanizes the people in the middle of it. And I just feel like your book is has such a deep commitment to bringing out everyone's full humanity. So thank you. I'm very grateful as a reader, as an American, for it. So let's start with my favorite question to always ask an author, especially a debut author, which is, what brought you to writing this book? Why you? Why this book? How did it all begin? Which I know you describe in the book too, but I would love to hear.
Of course, yeah. So I really wanted to show how El Paso has been a critical gateway into the United States long before Ellis Island even existed. And I wanted to really capture the history of this city and to show how this city and its history is key to understanding where we are in where we are in the immigration debate right now, right? How key to understanding our immigration battles and how those have shaped not only Latino identity, but American identity itself. And I really started thinking about this in the summer of 2019 when a self-proclaimed white supremacist drove down from Dallas to El Paso and killed 23 people. He told an officer on the scene that he was, quote, there to kill Mexicans. He posted a screed online echoing the Great Replacement theory, and he decried the Hispanic invasion of Texas. And this was one of the hardest assignments I had ever had to cover. I went to high school 3 minutes from there, Burgess High School, if there's anybody here from El Paso, I know you're gonna ask. And it affected a lot of people who were very close to me, including my best friend whose father was at the Walmart and escaped just as the gunfire started. So I was thinking a lot about this. I was a national political reporter for the Boston Globe at the time, and at the same time, the 2020 presidential election was ramping up. And in this election, immigration was already becoming a signature issue. It had long been a signature issue of Donald Trump, but El Paso was becoming the backdrop to that issue, and already people were calling it the new Ellis Island. But in this new Ellis Island, migrants were getting penned up under the border, children were getting separated at the border, and so I wanted to explore what does that really mean? Why do we keep coming back to this idea that Latinos and Mexicans are invading the country, when really, if you look at the history of this place, you will see that Mexicans have always been here, and because Mexicans have always been here and are part of the fabric of the country.
Obviously we work together and are covering immigration policy together, and the beat is relentless. How was writing this book different from your day job as a reporter?
Yeah, so to me, it felt a little bit like returning back to my roots. It was like finding my voice again that had been lost, or that I had often had to hold back in the daily grind of journalism. Especially in political journalism, there's like a box, and you have to color within the box, and you can have fun within that box, but it still feels very much like a box. And this felt like I was kind of breaking away from that. And I wanted to keep the rigor of the journalistic rigor of the reporting and the research. I wanted to hold the same standards that we do for a time story, right? But I really was trying to look for voices. I was really trying to summon those voices that I had grown up with. My mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, my uncle, they're all really good storytellers. And I feel like Mexicans are just really good storytellers, and we have such a rich oral history tradition in the Mexican community. So I really was trying to call on that, and I wanted it to sound like somebody in your family was telling you this story. I wanted it to sound like the corridos of Pancho Villa in some parts, this Mexican revolutionary that had made El Paso and Ciudad Juarez his home base. And so as I was traveling, I was on the campaign trail. I wrote this over 3 election cycles, and I had books in my bag. As a campaign reporter, you always have a bag packed and ready to go. But I also had like a bunch of other books, like essay books that I was reading, like from Mexican American scholars. I was making stops at different universities and different research centers, and I was really digging into oral history archives and listening to the voices of Mexicanos, and like really trying to take in that rhythm so that it had that flavor, that norteño flavor.
And so tell us about, so El Paso is your hometown, obviously, and that voice you're describing totally comes through off of every page, which all of you will discover when you buy the book and read it tonight. But I guess, what do you think people misunderstand about El Paso? And then to add to that, what did you figure out something that you yourself misunderstood about your own hometown?
Yes. So I felt like I was writing for 2 different audiences, right? Like I felt like I was writing for this national audience that usually when they think about El Paso, or they come to El Paso, it's through this lens of national security and the border wall and the drug war, and not the vibrancy of its people, not this rich exchange that exists between these 2 countries, right? Culture, trade, ideas. So I felt like with that audience, I was like starting from the very, very beginning, like we always do. Like we have to explain the border every decade. So that was one audience. And then the other audience that I was really thinking about was like the fronterizos, like people who grew up like me, crossing back and forth between these 2 countries and understood that binational culture already. I wanted them to feel like what they hadn't seen growing up, right? And then at the same time, for that audience, I was because I was discovering a lot of things about my own hometown that I had never really learned growing up. A lot of this history is forgotten history. It's not taught in high school. I was trying to kind of change our own conception about that, broaden our conception of where our perception of where we grew up as well. So I was trying to cover that, to see that it's a multiracial, multi-ethnic. It's not just Mexican and American. There's been these transnational waves that have flowed through the city, whether it's Chinese workers, right, Chinese laborers building tracks, or now more recently how the migration patterns have changed through that portal.
And what do you think El Paso tells us about where the immigration debate is in this country today? I mean, you really have a pulse on what's happening right now.
Yeah, so I think the easiest way, I mean, I've wrestled with how to answer this in other panels, but I think the easiest way is just to say, it shows us that we've been here before and we'll be here again if we continue to ignore this history. We have, again, going back to that Ellis Island idea, right? We understand Ellis Island as this representation of our most sacred ideals, that we welcome people from other walks of life from all over the world, and we debate whether we fall short of that, right? But we still hold Ellis Island in our national consciousness. We give it this special place, whether we're debating it or not, and we don't. But we don't hold El Paso that same way, even though it's in El Paso that you can see how this strain of how race and this strain of nativism have always shaped have always shaped immigration policy and how it's enforced. That it hasn't been an exceptional facet, but a central one. And so again, so if you look at the history through this city, you'll see a lot of the same scenes that we're seeing playing out today, right? You'll see people struggling with self-deportation and this twilight zone of like whether people are being self-deported, whether people are being forced to leave or not. Like in the 1930s, a lot of one of the Mexican families that I profiled, you could say they self-deported, but in many ways they were forced out. And so much like we're seeing today, you see surveillance and sweeps during the 1950s Eisenhower operation that were very similar today, where officers were taking these military-style tactics on the streets to round up Mexican laborers, and that was
That's Operation Wetback, right?
Yes,
yeah.
That's the model that President Trump often cited on the campaign trail, saying he was going to use it. So to me, it's like I just keep coming back. I just keep seeing echoes of my hometown and all of these crackdowns. I mean, it's going just to Minneapolis this last week, which we both covered. I was in this Latino neighborhood, in these Latino neighborhoods, the blinds, people keep their blind. People are buying special kinds of blinds to shade their windows so that officers can't look in. People aren't leaving home, and so I walked into the home of this one woman who couldn't make her cancer appointment because her daughter had just been picked up by ICE, and she had been sent to El Paso. And it was just when she told me that her daughter was kept in El Paso, it just like there was like that literal direct line through history for me of how it's just a history that keeps repeating itself.
You mentioned one of the families that you followed. Your book is just filled with people, right? As I was reading it, I was very curious about how you found the people, right? So maybe you can talk about that process and then maybe share with all of us a particularly memorable person that you feel like you would not have met but for writing this book.
Yeah, so I had been covering immigration for more than a decade. So some of the families, the families have the families are Mexican American, Chinese, Mexican, and indigenous Guatemalan. So I was trying to find families that were emblematic of this multiracial experience that I'm talking, multi-ethnic experience, and that were emblematic of the migration experience through this portal. And so some of the families I had met actually reporting the Rubio sisters, for example, who were deported as children, and then went on to go on to become the first sisters to serve in the California legislature. I had actually been covering when I was a State House reporter in Sacramento, and the Democratic leadership at the time was positioning itself as this center of resistance to the first Trump administration. And so Latino lawmakers there who had already gone through a very nativist period during the 90s were speaking to that on the floor, and one of them happened to name check El Paso Juarez, and so of course afterward we talked and asked each other where we went to high school. So that's how I had met them, and then the other families I found through the research. One particularly memorable family was this woman. I kept coming. I had seen her picture before growing up because it's a pretty historic photo, and it's a picture of a woman who's dressed as a soldadera, a female combatant of the Mexican Revolution, and she had long black hair and bandolier, you know, the bullets across her chest, and she's dressed in this black dress. And I had always thought she was a Yaqui indigenous woman because she's identified as such in some of these books in these archives, right? In some of these captions, she's labeled as such. But once I actually started digging into her history, I realized she's actually Chinese Mexican. And so I start trying to find, well, are her relatives still alive? And so I start looking for them. And I realized they're immigration judges and lawyers who have really been shaped by their grandmother, and that one of them actually has a direct tie to the shooting. And I will leave that. I will let you find that out.
That
through the
family is
book.
incredible. I thought I knew about like Chinese immigration in North America, and I had no idea there was that large a population in Mexico. So that part was fascinating.
Thank you.
What are you hoping that people will take away from reading your book?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things. I mean, I've just been thinking a lot about how this deportation and detention apparatus that originated on the southern border and in many ways went unchecked on the southern border is now being unleashed into the interior of the country, right? And how did that allow? How did we allow that to happen? And a lot of that has to do, as I explain in the book, through that fear of the other that allowed that to be possible. So I think I really just I was really trying to show how dangerous this strand of nativism is, and how long it's been, and really look at how the violence, the shooting, and each of these nativist waves hasn't been this like singular issue or a rupture in our history, but part of this much larger sort of legacy. So that's just kind of thinking about that, how we allowed that to happen, and then what it says about us that we don't know this history. And then but I also was playing a lot with the idea of identity and how often it changes, and legality and how often it changes, and how arbitrary it can feel for people, like how we're seeing another way that we're seeing that play out today, right? A lot of people crossed, hundreds of thousands of people crossed under the Biden administration under these humanitarian parole programs that were considered legal, are now losing that status, are now finding themselves in these really gray areas where, you know, they're being picked up and put in detention. So how that can really change. And so I was playing with all those kind of layers of how borders are just constantly moving.
Let's talk more about the border, actually, because I feel like in news stories, as the two of you are writing, you sort of just, it's the border, you know, border security. And I was just struck in your book at how you were trying to also show people, like, what is the history, like, what are we even talking about? So maybe tell us, like, US-Mexico border, we have this idea that it's like almost protecting our sovereignty, our nationhood. What is that, like, what is the actual origin of that border?
Yeah, so I actually start the book that way, right, with the story of the Niños Héroes, which were these 6 Mexican cadets who died during the U.S.-Mexico War defending Mexico, and I was trying to show how the United States, most of the Southwest sits on land that was once Mexican, that was once Native American, that was once Spanish, and so we used to have this, how we've really flattened this large, broad swath of of how we think about our culture, right? That's what I was getting at. That Latino identity is such a critical part of American identity, well, whether we realize it or not, because the United States was Mexico before, and so that's what I was really trying to show, and that's yes.
And then I think you captured the irony of trying to press back an invasion on land that was once Mexican, right?
Exactly, and who we see as invaders.
Yeah, the idea of the invaders being invaded was so powerful. You know, you're just such a thoughtful reporter and writer while you're covering this, you know, intense beat. How was this experience of writing this book? How did it inform your weekly and monthly stories on immigration?
I think it made them more. It's made them richer, fuller. I think the history. I really try to bring history, even if it's a little bit. I mean, I know it's really hard in a daily news story, but I think just having that context has been really crucial to showing that broader legacy and not having a knee jerk reaction to whatever the president is saying or whatever whatever policy is coming out, and being able to come in with that just broader scope, that broader lens has been helpful.
And I'm curious because in a way the border has kind of quieted it as a story, oddly. Like immigration is a huge story, but the border itself feels like it's kind of receded from the front. I guess based on all this work you've done on the border, where do you think we are in that, right? It was sort of a moment of high panic and a lot of journalism coverage, really. And now it feels like, well, we're looking elsewhere. But does that feel to you like a semi-permanent state? Does it feel like any moment now that might change? Sort of just bringing your knowledge of this place now to what we're seeing. How do you think about where the border fits sort of going forward?
Well, I mean, I think the border now is everywhere. I think Republicans have been saying it throughout the 2024 campaign that every city is a border city, and they've made that true. You can see that in how they're bringing border patrol from the border to Chicago, literally to Chicago. So I think the border, I think we are in a situation where, because there's been such fear of demographic change, which is another thing that I was looking at in the book. There's been this fear of such demographic change in these cities. We've allowed that greater enforcement in these cities, and at the same time, that's allowed an erosion of American civil liberties. And then that's what I mean about. That's what I think the question for me is where we go from here, is how much of that erosion are people going to allow? That I'm curious about that, and I do think that the story always comes back to the border eventually. Like if migration patterns are constantly fluctuating, there's so much instability in the world right now. Like I think it's just a matter of time before the story returns to the border. I mean, that's why we are explaining El Paso to the country every decade.
Why do you think Republicans have been so successful in, really shaping the political narrative and focusing on the border? I mean, this is the way that President Trump came into power, was talking about the people coming across the border. Why is that so? There's an ability to get voters to side with them with these types of comments. Why is that so resonant with voters?
Yeah, well, I think, and this is what I was trying to show throughout the book as well, is that this deportation and detention machine was an apparatus, and system was built throughout Republican and Democratic administrations, and the rhetoric has been the same coming from either party at different times throughout history. So I think that fear of the other has always been so prevalent. It's what I mean when I say that by studying this history through El Paso, you can see how central race and nativism and xenophobia have been to immigration policy. So I think it's the ground has been softened. Like it's been there for so long. It's just been such a part of how we think about immigration. And then on the other the other thing that I was going to say, like what was the second part?
Why it's so resonant with voters?
Oh, and well, the other part that I cover in the book, and this is more of it's not a main thread, but it's a thread throughout, is just the rise of right-wing media and right-wing radio. You see it as the Rubios are growing up. The Rubios are growing up in California and during the 90s, and the rhetoric against Mexicans and Latinos was so high at the time. And so I was trying to show how it was just getting louder and louder and louder, and more money was going into it.
What would it take to change that, I guess? I'm curious. I mean, just demographic-wise, you point out this is like just an enormous group of Americans, right? Not just Latino, but also literally Mexican American too. What do you think? There's so many people who are here of this identity. Why does it still feel like it's so easy to dehumanize?
Well, actually, I think what's different now is that the pushback is greater than it's ever been. If you look at the historical record, for example, nobody was defending the Chinese in the 1800s. Not even the most progressive liberal activists were speaking out. And now you are seeing that pushback, like especially in Minneapolis, it's hit so many facets of society. You have yoga teachers coming out. You have women and in yoga pants running, in Chicago, yelling at ICE officers. That feels very different to me. So I wonder how much longer it'll work as a strategy. And I don't want to be naive because, like I said, we keep coming back to this place. But I do think that it is something different. Something to me did feel different in Minneapolis about the pushback, because like I was saying, the strategies and the tactics that law enforcement officials, that federal immigration officials are using aren't new. We've seen a lot of those throughout history. We've especially seen them on the border. The strategies that people are using to push back, whether it's civilian officers recording law enforcement and chasing federal law enforcement agents. Chicanos used to do that on the border in San Diego in the 90s, chasing after Minutemen. So and a lot of organizers in Los Angeles developed some of those strategies. So the strategies and the tactics and that are causing the confrontations to escalate on the other side aren't new, but the people that are getting involved in using them is different. It's been like a massive scale. Now, do we see that everywhere else? Is Minneapolis unique because it's such a small place and it has a history? It has a history of organizing. It organized. It's the center. It's where George Floyd was murdered. So it has a different legacy. Do we see that replicated? I don't know.
Do you see this already shifting how Latino Americans, Mexican Americans view immigration policy? Because as you've reported so much, oftentimes they do support tougher immigration policy. Do you think that in this moment that might be changing at all?
Well, yeah, I think that is changing. I think, but the big question to me, for example, just coming out of this Texas election, is Latino evangelicals. It's like a fascinating question to me, like where they are, because after that to me was the first sign that support for the Trump administration agenda was beginning to crack. When Kilmer Abrego Garcia was sent to El Salvador, to that maximum prison at CCOT, I went down to his county, and I went down to his county to see how people were reacting.
Where
in Prince George's
county,
north of here in Maryland. Yeah. So to see how Latino voters were reacting, and I walked into this large Latino evangelical church, and I didn't think the pastor was going to speak to me, but he ends up speaking to me. He's a Republican. He prayed with Mike Pence at the White House, and he's sitting there talking about how much he regrets his vote, and that he can't believe that so many members of his congregation are being affected by this, and how cruel it is that students are being taken away. And I thought maybe it was just him, but I stayed and was talking to other voters that were coming out, other Latino voters, and it was just kind of the same echo of the same concerns that he had said. And so that's when I really, and this was pretty early on when I began to hear that the cracks in that support for that tougher enforcement that people seem to want. I think once they actually started seeing what it looked like, there's been a lot of concern, and I've seen that over again. I was just in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, in another really swing county, and I'm just I'm hearing the same thing. But is it enough to vote against a party that they've always voted for? I don't know.
We saw during the Biden administration this decision in the last year to essentially cut off asylum claims at the southern border to try to fend off what was seen as a massive political problem for the Democrats. Do you think we're at a point right now, moving forward, that both Democrats and Republicans have agreed that crossings at the border and this idea of gaining asylum through that process, that's that's gone now?
Well, we wrote about this. I think yeah, I think well, I think both parties have agreed for such a long time that this system is broken and that it was expanded in ways that, that it's being used in ways that it wasn't, you know, that it wasn't that it was being used in ways that it wasn't created for, right? Or at least that's how they see it. Whether that's true or not, it's a different debate. But yeah, I mean, like we said, we wrote right ahead of the election, asylum seemed like it was going to drastically change and be drastically limited, regardless of who was in power.
What gives you hope these days? When having worked on this book, having met all these people who are in the middle of it, I guess, first of all, are you in touch with, I assume, a lot of the people who are in your book, and how are they living through this moment too?
Yeah, I mean, what gives me hope is seeing how far some of these families have come, and I don't want to give too much away, but of how they've been able to achieve the American dream, regardless of what their grandparents and their ancestors went through, right? But what gives me hope, going back to Minneapolis, I was talking to this this construction worker. He does carpeting, and he had been pulled over at the side of the road. He was in a landscaping truck, and so he was pulled over. And he says he was pulled over because an officer actually told him this, that they looked Hispanic and that they pulled him over. And he had to abandon his truck on the side of the road. His brother-in-law and his son were sent to El Paso because of their asylum claims were in question. He was released because he had a trafficking visa, and of course he tells me this horrific story about how he had been endured forced labor upon crossing into the country. So he has this just really heartbreaking story he's telling me about. But to me, I just keep thinking back to his truck and how he had to leave it abandoned on the side of the road, and now it's in a towing company. It's in its towing yard, and he can't get it out because it's under his brother-in-law's name, even though he spent 3 years trying to he spent 3 years of savings on that truck. And he's telling me about how it's his livelihood, it's his like piece of the American dream. It's got all his tools, it's got 200 yards of carpeting material in it, and he doesn't know what he's going to do. And I'm asking him, and he was only detained for 24 hours, but like his whole life has just been turned upside down by this one arrest. And so I'm having a hard time keeping it together. And I asked him, like, well, what are you going to do? And he just tells me, he's like, just in Spanish, right? Like, don't worry about me. I've been through worse. And I heard the echoes of all the families that I had spoken to in that moment, because there's a lot of strength of that in El Paso too.
During the years you were working on this book, what would you say was the most challenging part of getting this project done?
I'd say just the travel, because when you're a campaign reporter, I think I was in 24, 25 states in like a year. So, and sometimes it'd be 4 states in 1 week and 3 cities in each of those states. And so you become really close to the people that you're traveling with in those those press travel pool vans. And I know some of them would watch me reading or writing, and even after we've spent the whole day trailing candidates and talking to voters. So it was a really hard project.
Did you have a favorite trip that you went on to do? I mean, you went to El Paso, obviously, but where else did the book take you?
I went to Chihuahua, and I love that trip. I actually went with my mother, and I talk about it in the book. And we were trying to find our own house as well, and we're our own grandmother's house where she had grown up in that trip, and we just really grew close. And I was just learning so much about history that I didn't learn growing up. And then I also went to the Ixchil region, in the Maya Ixchil region in Guatemala, and that was an incredible trip. And I just got to meet so many amazing journalists through that experience as well, who were just massive collaborators.
You know, in our job, we're almost separated from the story. We are independent arbiters of what's happening day to day, week to week. What was it like for you to write so personally about your own identity in this project?
It was hard. I didn't want to at first. I, like any journalist, I was like kicking and screaming at the beginning. Like I just didn't. Yeah, you know, the original proposal, I didn't include my family at all. I didn't include myself at all. And then as I was writing it, I thought, then as I was like reading it over and editing it, I just thought like it needed a guide, somebody that could kind of bridge the, you know, an outsider's perspective, because I had left El Paso with an insider's perspective. And then even as I was working on it, I was like still like stubborn about like how much I wanted to include in my editor. It was like, you need to put a little bit more of yourself in there. People will be curious about it. And I didn't really start to believe that until I was in the Martinez's home. So the Raul Reyes is a historian, and I profile his grandparents in the book. Who his grandfather was a laborer, one of the many laborers who crossed through the town. But I was sitting in their living room, and they were showing me this document with all the things they carried when they were forced to repatriate, where they were forced to move back to Mexico during the 1930s, during this really harsh period, right, where Mexicans were getting blamed for taking away jobs. And
I just want to be that U.S. citizens were deported. I mean, it was a massive deportation that we, again, have lost to history. But yes, go ahead.
Yes. So he's telling me about this really, really painful time, and his grandparents actually lost everything once they moved to Mexico, and ended up, you know, for a period begging on the streets for coins in Chihuahua. And I just felt like such a hypocrite sitting there, because it was dawning on me like I didn't know much about that. That was the first moment where it really was dawning on me like I don't know much about my grandparents' history, and I haven't even asked these hard questions of my own family's, you know, of my own family and my own family's past, and what do I need to know?
And then I'm going to ask maybe a last question. Let's see if more hum, and then we can open up to questions from all of you. So I think our mic is up here if you have anything. So speaking of your family, what do they think of your book?
They haven't read it in full yet, because they have to read it. It's in English, so my mom has to Google Translate. But she loves it. I what she has read, she has loved. And it's been that's been an unexpected thing, just how overcome I've been with emotion. And she wrote this just beautiful tribute on Facebook the other day, and it was just so it was just I had to hold back tears reading it. And because I was also realizing, like, there's the voice I was hearing as I was writing.
Oh, that's so beautiful, Jazmine. Thank you for sharing that. All right, questions from our audience. Anyone want to come up, please?
Well, I should begin with, I, like your family, have not read your book yet. They have the language, very good language explanation, and I don't have that, obviously. The book seems to cover both a fairly long-term history of the issue as well as more timely recent. I do want to ask you about the longer-term look. It seems like at least early in the book you contrast Ellis Island, say, or Eastern immigration over the last, century and more with the southern border. But the southern border has a long history as well. Are you able to adjust for some of the basic differences between those, and get at the question of why there is any difference between the two? Does it have anything to do with European immigration and Northwest or even Southeastern European immigration in the case of Ellis Island, and Ladino and Chinese immigration in the case of the southern border in the El Paso?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
there a fundamental difference between how Americans are willing to accept, or is that not really the thing?
No, there's a whole chapter that goes into that and more closely explores those differences and how and explains how the migration through the southern border has been more of this ebb and flow where, you know, in Ellis Island people cross waters, right, to arrive and stay and pursue the dream, and on the southern border it's been more of this ebb and flow of largely blue collar workers, but also intellectuals and activists during the Mexican Revolution, right? That were coming in and then cast out during these nativist periods. So, and it goes into the theories of race that and identity that led to that. It does break that down a little more. Yeah.
So too big to summarize here.
I wonder too on that. That's such an interesting question. I never thought of. I wonder too if that's like a lag too, right? Because the Ellis Island period is like 1880, like it's like turn of the 20th century, and so that sort of took time to metabolize, I think, into the American narrative. But the story you're telling is, you know, it's still actually fairly recent. It's historical, right? But it's still relatively recent, maybe.
Yeah, I should have said this before, but it seems like one difference between the two is that at least now we think of Ellis Island, we Americans think of Ellis Island in a generally positive light over time, at least we have. Whereas the southern border is much more divisive in terms of American opinion about it. So,
even though Ellis Island was like, yeah, even though Ellis Island was totally open border, right? Yeah, and Angel Island too. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
do mention Angel Island as well.
Please.
Hi, Eduardo Lerman, proud East Sider, Hanks Knights. But I don't know if in the book you mentioned people's high schools, how important it is for us El Pasoans. But going back to the question about, you know, how Minneapolis reacted to, you know, the last several months there. You know, one thing I talked to a pollster recently, Americans no longer have the perceived chaos on the border to drive their fear anymore. So they are now seeing what we have as border residents seen all our lives, but just now in a more blatant, you know, everyday fashion. So because their vision now is a little bit more beyond just people in cages and, you know, the violent caravans coming across. Would love your thoughts on that. If, you know, we don't have that as everyday Americans, and Jacksonville and Atlanta and other places don't have that blinder anymore of the chaos, perceived chaos on the border, that now they're seeing what overreach looks like for the first time, and something that we've always seen, even in interior enforcement.
No, go ahead. I didn't. Yeah, no. I've definitely encountered that as well. You know, there were some moments out there where I would be talking to someone, whether it was like a civilian observer or just a regular resident who had been out, you know, had come out with in a bathrobe to film because they were so concerned. And they would tell me like, no, but this community is safe, you know. And I'd say, oh, I'm from El Paso, I'm from the border, you know. And we'd get into this conversation about how, you know, these tactics have been challenged, you know, going back since the 80s and 90s, and they're like, no, but this community is so it's full of neighbors, like we know each other. And I'm like, but what are you saying then about my community? Like, why do you see it that way? I mean, not that we would get into it because I'm a reporter and I'm just there to absorb and witness and I don't say anything. But I in my mind I'm thinking like, well, what do you think El Paso looks like? You know, like what do you think? You don't think my community looks like this?
Yeah, hi. Having spent years writing about your hometown, could you talk a little bit about how your perspective changed of how you view El Paso? If there was either like a newfound appreciation, or if the sentiment even changed at all a little bit during that process of writing this book?
Yeah. So when I had graduated from high school, I had seen this book. I don't know if you've seen it, The Ringside Seat to the Revolution by David Dorado Romo. And so it's mostly a photography book, but it has some history of some of the characters in the book, like the Magonistas, who are these rebels during the Mexican Revolution that are plotting to take down Porfirio Diaz, the dictator in Mexico, and they're operating and holding meetings, these secret meetings in El Paso's hotels and bars and dark alleys. So he had covered some of that history, but it was the first time that I had seen our city portrayed that way, right? Like that there was like such a rich history right around us, like all around us. That was the first time and I was what? I would have been like 17 at that point, right? 18. That's how long it had taken for me to see the city in that way. But it was a very cursory look that I took at it, I was going off to college. I didn't really pay much attention to it. I had kind of dropped it, but I came back to that book as I was doing the research for that, and really digging into that history just made me appreciate where we're from so much more, like just how critical it's been to both countries. And the other thing that I realized as I was working on this was I went in there trying to tell the story about how El Paso has been misunderstood and the United States just doesn't put it at the center of its history. But then I'm talking to Juarez historians, and they're walking me, we walked along all the downtown plaza. They were showing me all these, not only historical sites from the Mexican Revolution, but even years further back, where the president of Mexico, Benito Juarez, had ruled in all of Mexico as he was on the run from the French, right? From the post office just there. And there's like these museums that they have like resurrected, they have worked hard to like reopen and recreate. And so it made me realize that Juarez too had also been very misunderstood and had never been placed at that the Mexicans don't give Juarez its own appreciation. It just again, it went back to that idea that I was playing with in the book, like who gets to tell the story and who gets centered and who doesn't, and that idea of borders. So I learning that there was this like intellectual strand always running through the city, this tradition of independent journalists working out of one of them was living right next to me at one point. I had been living in the apartment complex right next to her all along, and I didn't even know.
I think you kind of already answered this, but I'll ask it anyway. Growing up, did you ever have any conception that you would write something like this about your hometown? And then, what advice would you give to a young Latina who also wanted to write someday? What would you say to that person if you could go back in time?
Yeah, I would say stick to your roots. Remember where you came from. Like, just always remember where you came from. I think that's what I've always followed. And no, I didn't think I would write a book. Like I know journalists are going. I know many journalists who think like, oh, they're just looking for their next book project, or they think they're going to do it. I really didn't think I would even ever write a book. No, it seems so far removed from your experience as a young Latina growing up.
So in your description, this is cyclical, every period of time. So we always look at what happened to create we often look at what the repression. Like that, when you're bringing up the 1930s, I'm thinking the Depression, right? That was economic. There was a lot of political turmoil. But could you look at what happens to change, instead of looking at what the clamp down, look at why does the clamp time sometimes stop? What are the factors that create a change to increased acceptance of immigration and migration in the United States?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I think we should be looking at more closely. I think I should have done that more in the book, but I was trying to balance it out. I didn't want it just to be a story about violence. I was also looking at this idea of like la conciencia colectiva throughout the book, right? That ethic of again, that I'm talking about, these independent journalists and activists and progressives kind of fostered in El Paso during that time, which was like coming together for that collective good, coming together for their neighbors, pushing back against these ideas of white supremacy, whether sometimes imperfectly, right? Because they were pushing back with ideas of like mestizaje, which has its own problems. But yeah, so I really was trying to show it, not only the city, not only as a center of resistance, but the push, not only as a center of where you can see. Not only as this witness to racial violence, but the pushback to that.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi. I have two questions. The first is, what did you learn about yourself as an author that you didn't know about yourself as a reporter? And then I can wait for the second, or you can answer. All right.
I would. What did I learn about myself as an author? I just felt freer. Like I said, I just felt a lot more liberated to be me on the page. I think it took a while at the beginning. I think I was still, like I said, I was stubborn about not putting myself in the book. I was stubborn about how long I went. You know, I cut a lot of things because we're so used to cutting. But yeah, I felt braver.
When you got out of the box, you came out of the box braver.
Right.
And the second is, I wonder if you thought at all about what was at stake with this book being published in this time, when we have a government that is looking for any target, when we have, any scapegoat, and, while your intentions were to give, life to a community and illustrate and illuminate the texture of it all, we're in a climate where that's not necessarily appreciated, and in fact can be used and weaponized. So I wondered if that crossed your mind at all.
I did, of course. Yeah, no, I thought about it a lot. I worried about it, but I just think ultimately, like, it was just so important to me. Like, it just felt like it just felt like it needed to be said, So that felt more important to me than whatever could come, whatever negative thing could come of it. And I just remember, like I said, when I first came across that ringside seat to the revolution book that by David Dorado Romo, how much it just broadened my perception of my hometown, of Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans are usually portrayed as really passive, or criminals or drug dealers, and just to see how full and rich my community was, it filled me with confidence, with this newfound confidence that I had in some ways, but like it just made me all the more curious and all the more interested, right? And I just wanted to like spark the same thing in someone else.
Great, thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thinking about El Paso in this context for the first time, actually, I'm really interested in like the economic story. There's all kinds of, economic narratives about immigration emanating from the political right. Immigrants bidding up the cost of rental properties or taking Americans' jobs. If these narratives were true, then, El Paso would be like hell on earth. It would be, a really difficult place to live. So I'm curious about like the macro perspective of like, how does El Paso absorb? I mean, it has a long history of absorbing the, kinds of people, the different kinds of, the different groups, the different individuals that you talk about. But also, because your book is so narrative focused, I'm curious if anyone you spoke to for this book has a particularly interesting economic story of how they, found work or found places to live that you'd be interested in sharing.
Yeah, I mean it's all throughout the book. I mean the main thread of it is showing how these laborers are actually crucial to our economy, right? Their work and effort. And one of them is these sisters I was talking about, the California, the women that went on to become the first sisters to serve in the legislature. Their father was a bracero, so I mean, the story is all about workers. It's like that it really is the heart of the book. So I think Sabino's story is really critical to that, because he's one of these men who comes across the border and is doused in, goes through the delousing process at the border and goes on to work in farms and then construction jobs throughout the country, and that was what was really important to me. But again, what was really important to me was just like really centering on the people, and showing how immigration had shaped their lives, and in turn how they had shaped the city and the country.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So hi. I am actually also from the border. I am from Laredo, Texas. And I think the times that I've gone home, I'm starting to hear more and more the narrative of, I think, folks who have lived there for a very long time being a little bit more defensive and protective over the American dream, and falling into the narrative of like, these people are coming to take away that dream that I earned. They're not coming in the legal way. They need to come in the way I did. And I was wondering if to the people that you talked about for your book, did you hear that narrative? Like, how often and when, and what do you think was the straw that kind of broke the camel's back when it came? Because a lot of these folks didn't think like that before, but then more recently they have. And if there's a path to kind of bring them back into remembering kind of how they thought previously.
Yeah, and I do go into that in the book as well, like toward the end, because I do show that is that, like I said, it's very layered, right? I'm trying to show how, in different ways, how today's oppressed become tomorrow's oppressors, right? I do play with that idea, or not play, right? I do explore that idea, right? And yeah, I was hearing it from the families I was profiling. It was really fascinating because like I said, I was interviewing Latino voters and American voters all across the country as this was happening. But then I was also becoming really close to the families that I was profiling, because I was sitting with them like 6 hours a day at their kitchen table. So they were like essentially like a small focus group as as these broader forces are playing out. And yeah, I had several families echo exactly what you just said about feeling frustrated. Well, these newer people that are coming in, I think it has to do with a variety of reasons. I mean, the immigration, the immigration itself, right? The Latino population is really diverse, and then the immigrant population has become much more diverse in recent years. And mostly when people are talking about newer immigrants, they're talking about Venezuelan immigrants, right? So it's like the division among Latinos being exploited, right? And intentionally, right, by one political party. So I think it has to do again with the way the Trump campaign was very intentionally trying to exploit communities and pouring a lot of money into building that narrative. And I think some of those people actually have come back. Like there was one of the family members that I interviewed is actually, like I was saying, he was a Latino evangelical. He crossed during the height of the drug war, and found solace in the church, and then well, a lot of the people who were helping out were Trump supporters, started echoing a lot of the rhetoric. But I just spoke with him recently, and he's concerned about what's happening. He doesn't like what's happening. So that's what I'm saying. It's like, that's why Latinos are like such a swing vote. Like you can see that in the book. Like you can really, reading it, you can see why Latinos are so divided among both parties.
So I'm curious, the United States isn't the only country that has a border. And so this is a worldwide issue. And people are probably familiar with the European Economic Union. The EU has at the moment huge immigration issues, but even places like, say, the Dominican Republic with Haitians trying to immigrate there for economic opportunity. You even have a country like Bhutan, which is, has issues with Nepalese immigrants, South Africa. So there's a huge list of countries that are facing these immigration crises. And I'm just kind of wondering if you've kind of, in some ways, also had the opportunity to step back and reflect on what you think is a moral and ethical immigration policy.
I was really just I actually was really just trying to focus in on the families and their experience. Like I actually had to cut, like there was times where I had to cut because I was really trying to, again, tell the story through their eyes and through how they experienced it. So that was more what I was going through. It wasn't not so much analyzing the broader picture. I was trying to analyze the history and the legacy of it. But as far as comparing it with other borders, that seems like a different project, maybe another book.
These will have to be our last one or two questions. Go ahead.
Hi, I graduated from Loretto in the late 1900s. So it's interesting, like growing up in El Paso, like I always thought the border was like the best part of the city. We'd park downtown, we'd walk the bridge, we'd go to the mercado. All of my Barbie furniture was the little wooden furniture that my mom bought me at the mercado. And I left El Paso, I went to New York, I moved to DC, and people were like, oh, so what's it like living on the border? I'm like, it's awesome. And, and it was always, DC has some rigidity about whether you're born here or not, and whether you're accepted or not based on where you were born. And it was a new experience because in El Paso, you've got the border, you've got Fort Bliss, you've got the university, and so it's so porous. The city is porous. You've got the maquiladoras. You're living on one side, you're working on the other. And so it always, there's like a culture in El Paso about loving the stranger, loving the new person. Everyone, even if you're not related, they're suddenly your primo, your prima, right? They're your cousin. And so I'm wondering how that came up in the book, that border joy that is missing from a lot of the narratives.
Oh, there's some party scenes. That was like my favorite part about working on the book. Actually, I like couldn't wait to get to those scenes. And also, I mean, there's a whole chapter on how Juarez was a mini Las Vegas on the border for a long time, and was actually the more cosmopolitan and progressive city of the two, the larger, more progressive city of the two. So I really. That's what I mean by trying to balance the violence with the resistance, with the hate with the joy. I was really throughout the writing, I was thinking about that. I was talking to historians about that, historians that were reminding me, border historians that were reminding me, like, hey, like, also show how vibrant it is. Don't get so caught up just because you're covering such a hard story and you're seeing the immigration become such a salient issue with every election, and you're absorbing some of that rhetoric unwillingly. So I had those checks and balances.
Thank you, Jazmine. Thank you to all of you for spending some of your Friday evening with us. Thank you for coming out.